Hi, this is Alan from Warrendale Community Church. We're in message 13, and this is about living for the glory of God in the freedoms. This overall study is the will of God. And we were looking at these 6 navigational thoughts in decision making in the will of God and for the glory of God. We looked at the first 3, which is edification over gratification, secondly, others over self, and third, liberty over legalism. Now we go on to our fourth navigational thought in decision making for the glory of God in the will of God is conscience over continuing. The idea of the conscience, others' conscience, over us just continuing on. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 28. But if anyone says to you, "This is meat sacrificed to idols," do not eat it for the sake of the one who informed you and for conscience sake. If the meal discussion turns in a different way, and someone says or makes a point to tell you that this food was sacrificed to the idol, then you don't eat. With freedoms, there's different facts or information given at different times that must be factored into the decision at times, making it yes to proceed or no to stop. Be thoughtful about the way information comes to you and pivot in a direction that lovingly considers others related to free areas. I want to explain a similar scenario that might happen in the future, and it's a little odd, but I think it might be helpful in framing our thought process. Say you go to a person's house to eat steak and potatoes because you thought it was a good idea and you want to get to know these new neighbors. And in the midst of the interaction and before you eat, they inform you that the steak comes from the Antichrist meat processing plant or the Mark of the Beast farms or the false prophet market. At this point, the freedom to eat before you knew was that the steaks are good and from God. But now the issue has come up that these are Antichrist prime rib steaks. And they are used to advance his agenda and to bring him honor. Then a new set of principles just kicked in, and you may refuse such meat. One has to consider differently in this situation because of how you were informed. The way it was pointed out to you and its connection to such evil may necessitate your change in the choice to eat. This information may come from the host or another possibly weaker brother, with each could slant it in a different direction. It goes further in 1 Corinthians 10:29, giving us this whole idea of being aware of others. It says, 1 Corinthians 10:29, I mean not your own conscience, but the other man's. For why is my freedom judged by another's conscience? So he brings up this idea of how does this interconnect? This area of considering involves more than your awareness, but other people. The question that should surface is about my practice in this freedom, which is decided by another man's conscience, just not my own. The word judge could be simply just to decide, for this man is not judging you for your freedom, but his conscience must be factored into my decision to continue to eat or not eat at the dinner party. The question is raised, is my freedom determined under the awareness of another? And yes, depending on the circumstance. The consideration that should control is that is it important to prove out the will of God in freedoms, and the idea is that my freedom rightly needs to relate to my brother. I must be willing to make my freedom submissive to my brother's awareness if the circumstances make it apparent that it is a real problem for him, and it's not just an issue of being legalistic and him controlling others' freedoms. Because sometimes it's like we get the idea of freedoms from false brothers, and then in Galatians chapter 2, verse 4, seek to bring true brothers into bondage by their legalistic practices, which is different than what we are talking about here. But in Galatians it says, Galatians 2:4, but it was because of the false brethren secretly brought in, who have sneaked in to spy out our liberties, which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to bring us into bondage. And so we have to be a little bit more defensive or resistant to that type of a thing. Another one is in Galatians 5:1, here such freedoms related to the law, which is a yoke of slavery, must also be stood against. Galatians 5:1, it was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery. So it's not talking about freedoms there, but it's talking about things that are significant in the general overall freedom from the law. So at one end of the freedom spectrum is liberty from the slavery of the law, to which we must firmly stand against. At the other end of the spectrum is the need to resist turning freedoms into a chance for the flesh to expose its selfish wants. And Galatians 5:13 adds to that. Another verse to add to this whole thought about the idea of conscience and awareness is really our purpose and directions is Romans chapter 14, verse 16. Therefore, do not let what is for you a good thing be spoken of as evil. So this is the overall rule in which we are to take this sense of being aware of how our freedoms interact with others. Another aspect, or continuing this whole aspect of this navigational thought, is 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 30. It says, if I partake with thanksgiving, why am I slandered concerning that for which I give thanks? The circumstances here is that somebody else's conscience is determining what choices he can make, and he brings up this objection because he's thankful for them. So it's your partaking with thankfulness is not the single determination of a freedom's acceptance and goodness. If I do it with the right attitude, why is it still wrong? Is partly what the question is. See, being thankful in the freedom is very important, but it does help to initially determine whether it was right or is a gift of God and it's good to practice, but is not the final determination of the profit of that right. And so this particular area concerning the conscience and the awareness is this. I need to factor in this whole idea. So your conscience is an informed awareness given by God to protect you and condemn you. And this is other people's conscience as well. It is a sense of right and wrong gained by your awareness of things. It is a danger detector for thinking functions and evaluating decisions. But other facets may be considered together to get the whole picture in determining God's design in a matter. One who has a passion for God's will should have no problem with pursuing many angles to get to the understanding of what is pleasing to God. We are to start from the simplistic idea that God owns it all and I am generally free, but as the information about an area of freedom is increased related to my weaker brother and his concern, then we need to reconsider for the sake of our brother and its liberty and our area of evangelism. Those are the areas that we consider. So the thing is that when considering our conscience, we need to realize, yes, we have liberties. That's the default setting, but I have to also factor in the conscience, my brother's conscience. And a verse about thankfulness and how it helps to determine things is in Romans chapter 14, verse 6. He who observes the day observes it for the Lord, and he who eats does so for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And that's how we should. That's how we help to determine areas of freedom. And it goes on, it says, he who eats not for the Lord, he does not eat and gives thanks to God. So generally, we give thanks. That helps to determine, but that's not the only thing. There is something more important or significant, and that is the conscience of others. Particularly, we're talking about the weaker brother. So the fifth navigational thought in decision-making in the will of God and for the glory of God, and this is the primary one, is glorifying God over offending. We're to focus on glorifying God. 1 Corinthians 10:31, whether then you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all for the glory of God. Freedoms are for glorifying God, not for indulging the flesh. The basics of life are pointed out here, eating and drinking. And then it expands it to whatever, broadens the whole point to include everything we do. So the glory of God is the honoring of Him by displaying His importance and weightiness in our actions. The glory of God is to be the reason for and target of our doing whatever. We are to be doing everything for the honor of God. The main proving of the will of God must be to bring importance to God. To dishonor God in the area of freedoms is not the will of God. Freedoms and their practices are not above the practice of glorifying God. This is an important point. The purpose of one existence will shape the means by which one lives. What do I mean by that? My actions are governed by my purpose. The reason we are given freedoms is to honor God in the use of them. What governs life, which includes these areas of freedom and decision-making, is the glory of God. What helps determine which is best in the area of the lawful is the profit for others, the profit for you, and the ultimate glorifying of God. This may seem stifling to the self-seeker, but a small adjustment to the one who loves others and loves God. Why flexibility must be used in relationship to others is because you are living for Him. This type of living includes not creating offenses where no offenses need to be created. This provides the conclusion to what is profitable and edifying in the area of freedoms, which is for you to live from the complex to the mundane for the praise of God. This focus controls your purpose, navigates you through the decisions within the law. Remember that within the area of the lawful, not everything will be profitable. The questions that need to be at the forefront to create the right kind of flexibility in the lawful areas is this: are you doing this for the glory of God or for the glory and pleasure of self? To emphasize my own profit over against the greater profit of others is not to live God's praise. This purpose should be governing your actions if you are living for His design. Any other design which is not in accord with the primary directive is off, not good, nor profitable. Colossians says this, Colossians 3:17, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through Him to God the Father. That is what living for His glory explains. So we have a sixth final navigational thought. So the navigational thought here is in the decision-making, in the will of God, for the glory of God, is pleasing over personal profit. Another relational type of thing. And this is in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 32. Give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greek or to the church of God. The ideal offense is to cause no one to stumble or be blameless or have a clear conscience. That's how it's used. The broad groupings are Jews and Greeks, the church of God. The same word offense is used in Philippians 1:10 and Acts chapter 24, verse 16, and it means they're blameless, or translated that way. So Romans chapter 14, verse 13 says it this way: therefore, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather determine this, not to put an obstacle or a stumbling block in a brother's way. So in the decision-making, within the liberties, within the freedoms, is we just don't want to be a stumbling block to other people. This continues in verse 33, back to 1 Corinthians 10:33. Just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, so that they may be saved. Again, the evangelistic focus is brought back up. We've already discussed that in chapter 9. But here it says Paul speaks about his personal pattern and his way of handling these range of liberties, rights, and freedoms that ultimately are not essential. The profit focus is for the many and not for himself. The ultimate end of people being saved. So there's an evangelistic, there's an edifying, and then there's the glory of God, these three aspects. And he's talking about here about other people and helping them to be saved. The all things are the areas of lawful freedoms. They can be done or not done for the benefit of edification or evangelism. See, the greater good is contrasted with the personal good. And I think it might summarize this. And we've already looked at Romans chapter 15 and verse 2, but we'll see verse 3, I think, helps add to it. It says, each of us is to please his neighbor for his good, to his edification. And then verse 3, for even Christ did not please himself, but just as it is written, reproach of those who reproach you fell on me. And so he sees himself as a representative of God, and that's how we are to do the same thing. And so the thing is, there's no reason to create offenses for the wrong reasons. There's no reason to create these ideas of just bothering people. Instead, we'd be generally doing things that would bring the pleasing aspect and not just what I want to do. So just remind, in conclusion, the 6 navigational thoughts and decision-making in the will of God and for the glory of God is this. I mean to make this determination. Is it edifying over gratification? Is it really helping to focus on others or self? Is it really focusing in my liberties or the liberties of or legalism? Is it about the conscience? About continuing, about glorifying God over offending others or pleasing over personal profit. So keep these in mind as we make decisions, and it will bring the glory of God through it if done rightly.